Hi, I'm Charles Galda, your host for Vision New England's Church in Action program. This week, I'm talking with Jarrod Spalding. Jarrod is the co-founder of Vision Partners. We're going to talk about that and a specific initiative he's doing. So, Jarrod, thanks for being with us again.
Oh, no, it's really great to be with you. It's such a pleasure to chat and hear about how God's moving here through New England.
Could you share a little bit about your background and how you came to be in New England at Vision Partners?
Yeah, for sure. So the long story is I have roots. My dad is a Mainer. He grew up in South Portland, in Cape Elizabeth. And so we used to travel as kids up here all the time. I went to college, down at Eastern Nazarene College, which, some people might know is now gone. It's one of the many small colleges, unfortunately, we've lost, recently, but we spent 4 years there, went to Ohio to be pastors. We were youth pastors in Ohio, my wife and I. And then I became the lead pastor at the church. So in total, it was about 15 years there in Ohio. Really sensed that we had helped the church come to a certain sort of stage of growth and that it needed a different kind of pastor to usher into the new season. And began praying and thinking about where God was leading us, and ended up back here. My wife, by the way, is a born and raised Lynn girl, and so she's a North Shore hardcore, and so we ended up back here in Haverhill, Massachusetts, where we live, and so that's been, it's been almost 9 years we've been here. Yeah, it'll be almost 9 years this fall.
And it was also, I think, the cheap real estate prices that brought you back.
Well, we joke, we joke all the time that the house we have in Haverhill, for the price we pay here in Haverhill, we would have like a mansion in Ohio, but we'd have something smaller in DC. Like, I'm originally from DC, the metro area, and we'd probably have a smaller house for the same price in DC. So I don't know. It's somewhere in there.
I would ask people, what brought you back? Was it the low taxes, the cheap housing, or lack of traffic?
Yeah, I know, right? I will say this, though. The one thing that we have here that we didn't have in Ohio, so we're in Haverhill, so about an hour and a half up to the White Mountains, an hour and a half to Portland, 30 minutes to the beach, like Hampton Beach, and then 45 minutes out to Boston. So we kind of like all that. In Ohio, we just had lots of cornfields. Yeah. So this is a win for us, at least.
There's a lot of reasons a lot of us are here.
That's right.
Yeah. And to counter all those things.
That's right.
One of them is what God's doing here, which is
exactly.
an interesting reason to be here. And I want to talk about that a little bit more, about what you're seeing in your world. But tell us a bit about Vision Partners. And you got started with that here and what they do.
Sure. So when we moved here, our intent was actually to plant churches. We really felt a call to do that. I've done some church planting work back in Ohio. But our first 2 years here was really sort of tumultuous personally. My father-in-law, 3 months after we moved, my father-in-law was diagnosed with terminal cancer. And so he lived with us until he moved into hospice care and then passed. And so, and then we just had a number of just difficult things. And so our first 2 years were really challenging. And it really put us in a place where we started asking the question, can we church plant? Can we actually do this here with all this weight that we're holding? And then I began to talk with some friends here regionally about that and what they were seeing and what they were doing. And really what we began to see is there's two sides to this coin. There's the new church plant, the new starts, which of course those things we want to be a part of. We want to see that happen. But then we looked around and we realized that there are hundreds and hundreds of small churches all over New England. And we started asking a question like, who's helping them? Church planting, yes, but what if we could even get just a sort of a tipping point of health for the small churches that already exist? What would it do for a community to have 4 or 5 healthy small churches? And it's like for Haverhill has close to 120,000 people last time I checked, give or take. And we have about 45 churches in this city.
Wow.
And yet not a single one of them, I think I should step back. There's probably maybe 2 or 3 that push close to like 200 people. So what that means is that in Haverhill alone, there's basically 1% to 2% of people in Haverhill are attached to a church. And I said, and yet we have 45 churches. How, like, what if we could just get some of them, healthy and functioning and missional and making disciples and stuff? And so that birthed a simple idea, like, what if we could catalyze disciple making in small churches? What if we could just do that? And so that's where Vision Partners was born, was this idea of how do we help create or catalyze disciple making in small churches from a whole church perspective. So I like to remind people that, like, Charles, if you're going to disciple somebody, that's one thing. And there's a certain skills and things that come with that, right? And spiritual health. If a whole church is going to make disciples, it's a different thing.
Yeah.
Because now you have to take into context. And so, like, here's a good example. We had a church all the way up in the mountains of Vermont that we were working with. And one of their particular challenges that roughly 3 months of the year, they can't meet with their people because of snowfall totals.
Yeah.
And so there could be 2 weeks where they don't see their congregation because you're stuck inside with snow.
Yeah.
And there's no infrastructure in the mountains with, like, good internet. So you can't live stream, like, that doesn't work. So how do you make disciples when, like, you have these big gaps of time where you just don't see people?
Yeah.
That's different than Lynn, where Lynn is quickly becoming a very strong Latino city. And so, for like an Anglo congregation, a traditional small church Anglo congregation in Lynn, they need to learn conversational Spanish that you don't have to do in Vermont, and so disciple making at a church level looks very different. And so that's what we saw that. We said, we looked around, we didn't see a lot of people doing direct sort of service to a church. So we thought maybe we can help.
We accept as normal that if you're a plumber, there's ways to do plumbing. If you're a carpenter, ways to do carpentry. If you're a programmer, there's ways to program, right? So in everything, and Jesus had ways to make disciples, but we kind of accept in this one area that we don't have a real plan where I'm equipped to make disciples. I'm a Sunday school teacher, so I teach the Bible, but that's just a component of discipleship.
That's a component. That's right.
But you're really trying to deal more robustly with how do we actually have a methodology, if you will, to make disciples in our church and to have everybody making disciples in our church.
Yeah. Because I think what we often see is we see a lot of churches that focus on the gathering components of bringing people to worship or to a Bible study or things like that. But don't really train people or help them do the ministry of disciple making when they're at work or when they're at soccer practice or when they're just sitting in their house with their kids. So we see that there's a training gap, so to speak, and that really unfortunately, pastors have their hands so full with stuff. Sometimes it takes an outsider to see where those kind of leverage points are and where those gaps are, and a coach to help walk through how do you sort of overcome some of that or fix it or build new, whatever the situation needs.
Yeah. Well, so now let's shift gears a little bit because there's a component of Vision Partners I want to drill down on a little.
Yeah, sure.
That we haven't really touched on now, but is fundamentally important.
Yeah.
And so I'm reminded of the It's a Wonderful Life, when the angel says to George Bailey, "Oh no, we don't have any need of money in heaven." And George Bailey says, "Well, it comes in pretty handy down here."
That's a great line.
Right.
I need to write that down.
And so you're doing things on what's pretty handy down here. And so tell me about this financially resilient church initiative you're doing.
Yeah, so it's fascinating. So this has been sort of secretly in development for a few years. We realized very quickly a couple of things. When we first started as Vision Partners, it was organizational disciple making, essentially, right? It's organizational design in theory and things like that, but with a disciple making emphasis. And we realized very quickly that if that's going to happen, then the pastor has to be a disciple maker themselves. They can be a great preacher and all of those things, but they have to be a disciple maker. But then what we watched as our churches were moving, we kept seeing our churches were running into a resource wall. They just didn't have, and so we realized pastors, even if they're making disciples and even if they're great like preachers and great at running the church, there still often is a challenge when it comes to resources. So money being one of them, time, volunteerism, all. And so we realized that if we can, in the small church, if we can help correct the financial components as well, then the church actually has the resources to do the work, to do the ministry in a long-term sustainable way. And so we're big advocates of thinking, you've got to act in the short term, but you have to plan for the long term. Because in New England, there's a rule of thumb in New England that maybe most people know, or the people watching and listening to this know, but in Ohio, we could probably get a new church plant off the ground in like 2 years. In New England, it's like 7 to 10.
Yeah. And that's to get to 100 people. And
that's right.
Radically successful.
And so the question becomes, do you have the resource? Do you have the ability to sustain that work for 10 years to sort of get there? And most small churches, if you just ask them right now, don't.
Yeah.
They've never been challenged to think like this, like to think like that kind of timeline. So the Financial Resilient Church Initiative was born out of a partnership with us and a few others, but like East Coast International Church in Lynn is a big partner of ours, and Pastor Kurt Lang. Kurt and I go back. We have a lot of shared history. But what really happened was his church started in Lynn with some of the sort of most impoverished people in Lynn. And within their first year, their church budget was running negative. And every time they added a family, they were going more negative. Yeah. Right. And so,
because there's some communities where it's either so small or poor that they could even all be tithing, which probably isn't happening.
That's right.
And you still don't have enough money to pay a pastor.
And that's right. And so Kurt early on, so even in the planting the church, Kurt early on took on, he would go to like thrift stores and buy items and then clean them up and resell them secondhand on like eBay to eliminate his own personal debt. So that so the church didn't have to pay him.
Yeah.
And so they started to do all of these really interesting things. So fast forward, we're 25 years later from their planting. And I started saying, Kurt, how is it that your church is worth millions and millions of dollars? How did you get here? And we started to think about what were the principles. So as opposed to
and by worth millions of dollars, you're talking about real estate.
So they own a lot of real estate. That's a big key piece to how, but it's not just they own real estate. They've made every piece of real estate part of the mission. And so they have houses that are for sober living. They have houses for transitioning out of incarceration. They have a house that protects women coming out of domestic violence situations. It's really everything they're doing is missional, but they've also found a way to make them like basically cash flow positive, if you will.
Yeah.
And so he and I sat down and started saying, well, then how did you get here? Like what, because the goal is not that everybody becomes like that church. And not every church is going to go into like being worth millions of dollars, and that's okay. The goal is, are we practicing sustainable financial, practices and means? And so we had been iterating on this and building on this for 2 years. This public version is first coming out is with a project at Gordon College, and the goal really is we want every church to be able to sustain the disciple making work for the long time, for the long term.
And so what we're talking about, and East Coast International or Kurt Lang's church, a good example, is they've done commercial stuff to generate revenue. So I remember just one of the houses he owns, and Kurt would never say, our church is worth millions of dollars. I know you and I deserve that, but he wouldn't say that. But he looks and goes, okay, so first floor is staff housing, second floor is missional housing, third floor is Section 8 housing. And we actually turn a profit on that we then are able to use to pay a minister to do X, Y, and Z, or to give this fund and where we, I know they've got a thrift shop they operate, which is different than the normal church thrift shop, because they'll take anything people donate, and then they're going to take stuff that isn't of a certain standard, and they're going to give that to other thrift shops. But this stuff they're going to sell and turn a profit, and that supports women coming trafficking. And so it's really innovative models. And so that's a different mindset. And so is that what we're talking about with the financially resilient churches, coming up with other things, other donations and tithes and offerings?
Yeah. So most churches are single stream income, right? Tithes and offerings. And that's not something we're looking to eliminate or get rid of. We think that financial stewardship piece and the generosity piece of that we're supposed to be as followers of Jesus, that's critical. But the question arises is this: even if your people are generous and it's still not enough, how do you do ministry with that? Mm-hmm. The answer isn't for our pastors and our churches to be poor. Yeah. And to think out of a poverty mindset, because we believe God is not a God of sort of poverty and scarcity. We have a God of abundance. And so the question becomes, how do we do this? So creating new revenue streams is a big piece of it. ECIC didn't start off with businesses like the clothing store. The clothing store is probably maybe about 4 years old. Yeah. So that's really recent. Their first purchase was not a church building. It was a house, like you mentioned. And the ground floor was church offices. A staff person was on the second floor, and the third floor is a public apartment, publicly rented. But they quickly learned that if they rented the public apartment properly, it paid for the whole house. Yeah. And so now they have a place for the staff person to live that eventually they ended up selling the houses back to staff people. So now the staff people have a place to live and they have rental income. So now you're keeping your staff in a long sense, as well as keeping helping them manage their own finances, So the goal here is a church that builds multiple revenue streams. Yep. So they can sustain the ebbs and flows of tithes and offerings and to sustain the ebbs and flows of just the economy as it happens. Most churches don't plan for things like inflation.
And there are churches today who are in this situation of there's not enough, we talked about plants, there's not going to be enough money for a long time. There's communities that are shrinking, that presents it. Communities in poor areas, that presents it. And then there's churches today who, we get by, but if giving trends persist, which God can change them, but if giving trends persist, we're all going to be struggling with this because the North American church runs on money and current trend money's drying up. That's right. And there's churches that are sort of one or two givers away from being in really a desperate situation. There's several churches that we're engaged with that are that we're coaching that are in that situation. And so I think we're at this sort of threshold moment, right? Where we're crossing into some new territory that we haven't been in before. And so churches have to begin to consider the economics. A simple way to put it is this. I tell the pastors we work with, you run a church in your mind and in your heart, but in the eyes of the United States government, you run a nonprofit. And so there is an absolute business component and financial, like economic component to it that says we have to manage and steward this well. And there's legal structures that are necessary. And I know you deal with those things too. But there's churches now, and I'm sure you know more about more than I do, but there's churches who are running cafes to generate revenue for ministry, counseling centers to generate and serve their communities all in one. And so we're seeing more and more of this. And so how does a church, there's not a role in the church today of the entrepreneur, the pastor of entrepreneurship, or most pastors didn't go to seminary or get into ministry because they wanted to run a business. How does fit this into the mission of the church?
Well, I think it's good that you said the mission of the church. The thing that Kurt and I share about all of this is that everything that your church should be doing financially has to be pointed towards the mission. It's not to gain for yourselves. It's not to have more money necessarily. It's to fuel the mission. And so that's a primary sort of principle is that through all of this is that you're not doing this to kind of grow your kingdom. You're doing it to grow the kingdom. And so I think that there's a number of different things. I think one, on the very simple side, pastors have to really engage the business community. So if you have small business owners in your church or finance people in your church, really begin to talk with them about how they see the organization of the church. Some churches have accountants and CPAs. Ask them, hand over your financial statements and ask them what they think, right? That's what they do as a living. We often skip over some of that simply because we believe sort of God's going to be faithful. And I think that's true.
Yeah.
And on the other side of it is, but God's asked you to be faithful and be a good steward.
Yeah.
And so bring in, I mean, a very simple step, bring in people with knowledge of business, people with knowledge of finances that can help you understand those pictures, because you're right. Very few pastors have ever had a financial class, especially like leading a nonprofit financially, which is what churches are.
Yeah. And so many pastors, especially church planters, are entrepreneurial from a ministry perspective, but I mean, I understand how a business runs, just like the guy who's entrepreneurial in a business context doesn't necessarily know how to plant a church. And so you may have that entrepreneurial spirit, but it may be in just a different place.
Yeah.
And so how would a church who's saying, okay, I hear the problem statement, I get it, and even if our church doesn't need it, we could be giving away more money, right? But so how would they get started?
Well, I think there's a couple things. One, I think you have to really start to ask the question, where are we financially? And what do we have? The number of times I sit down with a church and we'll do what you might call like an asset map, which really we just kind of list out and come together with like, what has God given us? What has God put in our hands? And almost every time, I actually just did this recently with a church, and when I asked the church, here on the wall, we have these huge sort of Post-it notes and these big lists, like 3 pages full of like, this is what God's given us. He said, well, and this is a church who thinks they're poor and they have nothing. I said, well, now what do you think? And one of the staff members said, I'm ashamed of ourselves. I said, well, what do you mean? Explain, say more. And she said, we've been sitting around like complaining and whining because we have nothing. And in like 20 minutes, we realized look at the abundance God has given us, and we've done nothing. We've been doing nothing with it. So I think it's really helpful to as sort of primary step. What has God really given us to use? Churches a lot of times will ignore like your parking lot. If you're in an urban setting, your parking lot's probably worth gold, right? Parking is huge in urban centers. But if you have land, that's valuable. We say every square foot of your building has value. And so like, what do we actually have that can really be used towards our mission? I think that's a primary step. Again, gathering people, your business leaders or your connections, or connecting to them in the community. If you don't have them in your church, maybe you have a friend that's a banker or things like that. Just ask questions. And the third thing I would say is this. I think you have to get really close. If you're going to make this mission, you have to get really close to the problems of your city. And so if you're not already doing it, like as a pastor, you should know like your city council or your ward representative or whoever those people are in your area.
Selectmen, have you?
Yeah, selectmen. You really should know them, because you should know what the city is struggling with. Because the real key to this is saying, if this is what the city is struggling with and we have these assets, how do they meet in the middle and help each other?
Yeah. Physical assets, but they can be intellectual assets too.
That's absolutely true. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I'll tell this quick story. In Ohio, when I pastored, we had and I can't come up with a reason, but we had an incredible amount of teaching professionals in our church, from like school principals and like ESL teachers, regular teachers, special ed teachers. We had teachers. Yeah. And so the constant question was like, well, then if we have this asset, like, how do we deploy this? How do we use this for people in our community? So.
Yeah. That's great. Now, where can folks, I think you have an event coming up soon.
We do.
So how do folks learn more about that? But how do folks learn more just in general?
Yeah. So in general about the Financial Resilient Church, the event, we're partnering with Gordon College to launch a cohort program. So it's limited seats in the first round, intentionally so. So we're taking about 8 churches, and so the pastor and a couple people from each church that represents sort of their team, and helping them walk through building a financially sustainable plan. Takes them from ground zero, wherever they're at. I tell people I have churches who don't write annual budgets. They don't have budgets they follow. They just kind of go, well, we have money, so spend it. And so it'll go from sort of like the bare bone basics of like, where are we starting? What do we need to do? There's three in-person events. We meet 3 times at Gordon College through the summer and into the early fall. And then there's coaching through the whole thing. So we'll coach for over the 7 months. And the goal really then is that by the end of this year, these 8 churches will be ready. They'll ideally have made ground financially in 7 months, but also be ready for their new budget year, roughly around the turn of the calendar. Mm-hmm. And so we'll coach with them and track with them through the 2027 year to kind of see how things are going and how their plan is going. But that's that initiative. The information has not yet come out with publicly, so we're working with Gordon, and that stuff should be coming out here at the beginning of April. Okay. And so I'm meeting with Gordon tomorrow on this stuff. So beginning of April, you'll start seeing it publicly, like with a web page and, that kind of all the usual stuff. For now, to ask questions or to learn about it or things like that, they can just contact me directly would be the simplest form until, like I said, everything becomes public.
And how do they do that? What's the best way to get you?
Sure. Honestly, email would be the perfect. It's just the simplest, quick, and then we can jump on calls and things like that. So my email is just my name, Jarrod, Jarrod, at framingthefuture.church. So Jarrod at framingthefuture.church. And that would be the simplest, quickest way.
And if folks have issues finding that, they can reach out to Vision New England. Yeah. We'll also have, once those details become available on the event, I'm sure it'll be on Vision Partners URL, your website, which is what?
Visionpartners.church.
And we'll have it, you'll give it to us, we'll get it on our event page too, so that people can be watching both those sites for it. Jarrod,
absolutely.
Thanks so much for being with us today, but thanks for really stepping into a very interesting, innovative space that I think is fascinating and really see what plays out in the cohort you're doing. Thanks for doing it. God bless you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Hey, this is Charles Galda, and I'm excited to tell you about Vision New England's annual Leading Together Gathering. It's May 6th and 7th at Gordon College, and it's open to anyone who leads a ministry in New England. We'll spend a day focused on disciple-making pathways and cultures and how you build them. We'll, over the course of the 2 days, also have a prayer meeting. We'll have workshops on managing change in a church context, on disability ministry, creative funding models, spiritual oppression, and a lot more, with plenty of time to connect with other people, build relationships, and build unity. Hope to see you there. You can register at visionnewengland.org. This program is created by Vision New England, which accelerates evangelism by helping the church work in unity to make disciples, do justice, and share Jesus, so New England will be transformed by the love of Jesus. You can find additional resources and support our mission at visionnewengland.org. We want to thank our friends at World Vision, who are celebrating 75 years of God's faithfulness and trusting Him with a worldwide vision to end extreme poverty for children everywhere. Join us next Sunday at 2 p.m. on Life Changing Radio. Thank you, and God bless you.